2 full brigades, over 100 armored vehicles, tanks, APCs, infantry support units, firepower, numbers, and the weight of momentum. A frontal assault that had all the hallmarks of classic Russian doctrine. Push hard, overwhelm, break through, and roll up defenders from the inside. On paper, it was a textbook operation, but the ground didn't follow the script. Because within minutes of crossing the contact line, the advance stalled, engines burned, tracks snapped, hulls cracked under invisible pressure. Something wasn't right. There was no grand artillery barrage from Ukraine, no massive show of force, no conventional defense line, just silence. Then came the explosions, not from enemy tanks, but from the ground itself. Minefields, dozens of them, layered, hidden, and laid with strategic intent. Russian vehicles funneled into narrow routes, predictable gaps between tree lanes and trench belts, channels that looked like openings, until they weren't. That's when the 1st Brigade began to collapse. Tanks that avoided the mines got lit up from a distance, not by other tanks, but by eyes in the sky, drones circling quietly above, marking every movement, every hesitation. And when those drones found targets, they didn't act alone. They called down hell. Artillery batteries that had been waiting, ATGM teams hidden in earthworks, cluster munitions triggered from beyond the horizon. No warning, no counter battery, just impact and confusion. Russian formations, trained to move in blocks, were now being picked apart like puzzle pieces, their movements observed in real time, their commanders overwhelmed, comms jammed, maps useless. Because this wasn't a fight between two armies. It was a test between speed and knowledge, and Ukraine had the edge. From the beginning, Ukrainian defenders didn't need to match Russian firepower. They just needed to know where and when to strike. That's what the drones gave them. Constant surveillance, a permanent eye over the battlefield, and more than that, coordination. Within seconds of identifying a convoy, that data was routed to fire teams, to tank commanders, to missile operators. The delay between observation and execution had been shrunk to near zero. No guessing, no waiting, just precision. And that turned every open field into a death trap. By the time the 2nd Brigade began its flanking maneuver, attempting to bypass the mine corridor through a patch of woodland, it was already too late. The routes were mined too. Ukraine had expected the flanks. They'd mined not just the obvious approaches, but the fallback zones, the safe spots commanders might instinctively choose when things started going wrong. Those instincts got their men killed. APCs detonated in the tree lane. Troop transports erupted in fireballs. Survivors tried to scatter, only to be met by hidden infantry teams with NLAW launchers, javelins, and RPGs aimed at the exposed sides of stalled vehicles. This wasn't a linear battlefield. It was a layered one. The Russians weren't advancing. They were being led, step by step, into choke points, into zones of destruction, into a battle plan that had been drawn before the first Russian engine even rumbled to life. And above all of it, watching, tracking, guiding were the drones. Quadcopters, fixed-wing scouts, loitering munitions circling silently, relaying every movement to Ukrainian forces below. This is how Ukraine fights now. Not in waves, not in mass formations, but in networks. Sensors talk to shooters. Shooters strike based on live updates. No movement goes unseen. No decision is made blind. And that's what destroyed the brigades. Not some secret weapon or new wonder missile. Coordination. The invisible thread that holds together modern combat. And when you have it, numbers mean nothing. That's why this battle feels so strange outside observers. 2 brigades destroyed. Over 100 vehicles neutralized. And no one knows how, because the fight didn't look like war. There were no massive tank duels, no endless artillery thunder, no rolling waves of infantry. There were simply losses. Sudden, complete, devastating. From a Russian perspective, it must have felt like hitting a wall made of air. Every maneuver preempted. Every route compromised. Every effort to regroup punished by precise artillery strikes moments after their positions were established. Their strength, bulk, armor, firepower, meant nothing when their every move was exposed. That's the new rule of modern warfare. If you're seen, you're dead. And Ukraine saw everything. The terrain played its part too. This was an open steppe. It was a maze of forest belts, hedgerows, irrigation canals, and pre-prepared trenches. Terrain Ukraine had lived in, trained in, and mined for months. They knew every contour. They knew where tanks would naturally drift, where bridges would force bottlenecks, where vehicle spacing would collapse under stress. That local knowledge was paired with remote firepower. Western artillery systems like the M777, rocket systems like HIMARS, sensors synced to firing solutions in minutes. And when things got tight, when it looked like a position might fold, it didn't, because combined arms kept the line intact. One of the most dramatic moments in the battle came when a Ukrainian infantry squad, pinned and partially encircled, called for extraction. A single Bradley fighting vehicle responded. No air cover, no artillery suppression, just one vehicle, threading the needle through wreckage, RPG fire, and machine gun bursts. It reached the position, extracted the troops, pulled back through smoke and shell craters. No losses. That's not luck. That's doctrine. That's what happens when armor, infantry, and intelligence work as one. And it crushed Russian morale. Because if your enemy can pull off coordinated rescues under fire, what hope do you have of taking ground? That's the real collapse in this story. Not the metal, not the vehicles, but the will. Russian troops, poorly briefed, poorly coordinated, began to fall apart under the pressure. Platoons split. Officers lost comms. Tanks pulled back. Some simply abandoned in the field. Not because the Ukrainian forces were overwhelming in number, but because the idea of winning collapsed. And that's what made this battle different. It wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a psychological one. Russia threw everything it had at a carefully chosen segment of the line and found nothing but resistance. Not heroic last stands. Not desperate defenders. But cold, calculated defense. Not by men alone, but by systems. Systems that told every unit when to strike, where to hide, how to wait, when to move. And that made the difference. In the end, 2 brigades didn't just fail to break through. They ceased to exist as cohesive fighting forces, destroyed not by the size of Ukraine's army, but by the shape of it, agile, informed, precise. The West calls it asymmetric warfare. Ukraine just calls it survival. And this battle, it will be studied for years. Not because of the weapons, but because of the discipline. Because of what it means when knowledge beats numbers. Because of how a country, outgunned and outmanned, used brains, not brawn, to erase 2 brigades from a map, and did it in silence. Now, the world is left wondering, how many more times will this happen? How many more armor columns will be shattered by invisible hands? How long before the attackers realize they're not breaking through, they're being broken apart? The wreckage still smolders, but the battlefield has already moved on. What Russia lost in that single offensive wasn't just armor or manpower. It was the illusion of control, the belief that numbers could overcome precision, that mass still rules the battlefield, that sheer volume of firepower could bend the line and collapse a defender's will. But Ukraine didn't break, because this was never about meeting force with force. It was about shaping force, redirecting it, isolating it, and then eliminating it with cold, efficient certainty. 100 tanks mean nothing when every kilometer they move is observed, when every track mark is mapped, when every movement becomes a signal to strike. This is the new era of warfare, shaped by data, driven by timing, and executed with surgical brutality. And in that domain, Ukraine is not just fighting, it's mastering. That's what makes this destruction so hard to understand for traditionalists. 2 brigades didn't fall because they were weak. They fell because they were predictable. Because in the new reality of war, predictability is death. You move in columns. You use the same supply roads. You rally in known tree lines. You fall into old patterns. You follow doctrines written for a different century. And Ukraine, backed by every bite of real-time intelligence it can harness, punishes every repetition. It's no longer about who has the biggest gun. It's about who has the earliest warning, who sees first, who reacts faster, who fires more accurately. Every Russian maneuver during that assault was tracked within minutes, not by satellites alone, but by an ecosystem of airborne sensors. Quadcopters drifting silently above the trees, fixed-wing scouts shadowing from altitude, electronic listening posts tuned to Russian comms chatter. The result? Russia was always visible, always exposed, and being visible now means being targeted. That's how Ukraine built its layered defense, not with walls, but with zones. Kill zones, suppression zones, interdiction zones. Each one mapped by drone and fired on by artillery. Not randomly, not indiscriminately, but precisely. Every Russian company that attempted to regroup was bracketed by indirect fire. Every armored push was anticipated by ADGM teams dug into hardened positions. And when they shifted lanes, searching for a new breach, they ran into the same traps. Mines buried not just in expected paths, but in fallback routes, in tree lanes, in valleys where vehicles would retreat when they came under fire. There was no escape, because this wasn't a static front. It was a net, and Ukraine had set it in motion long before the first Russian tank crossed a line. Behind that preparation was discipline, months of it, quiet engineering units placing mines and sensors, sappers weaving corridors of death, recon teams mapping angles of fire, and command structures evolving from rigid battalion formations to agile strike groups capable of coordinating between infantry, armor, artillery, and drone operators in seconds. Seconds. That's what matters now. The window between seeing the enemy and killing the enemy is so small, it can no longer be managed by old-school hierarchies. It requires networked reaction, not centralized command. And that's where Russia failed. Because while its vehicles moved forward, its commanders were still deciding. By the time orders reached the front, the conditions had already changed. Ukrainian units were already reacting, already repositioning, already preparing the next ambush. This is what it means to fight a data-driven war. You're not trying to overwhelm the enemy. You're trying to outpace their decision cycle. That's how Ukraine turned 2 brigades into a smoking ruin without ever fully revealing its own strength. It was never about stopping the assault head-on. It was about dislocating it, fragmenting it, breaking it into parts small enough to kill without risking large formations. This kind of warfare doesn't need heroic charges. It needs precision strikes, well-timed withdrawals, and information flowing faster than bullets. And when it comes together, you don't just survive the assault. You erase it, and you do it with less. Less armor, less manpower, less artillery, but more control. That's the lesson. Control isn't about territory anymore. It's about time. If you can control the timeline of a battle, if you can see what's coming before it happens, and react before your enemy finishes thinking, you win. It doesn't matter how many tanks are rolling your way. If they're all rolling into traps, they're not advancing. They're committing suicide. And that's what this offensive became. A suicide run without anyone realizing it until the 1st Brigade was already in flames. By the time the 2nd Brigade understood, it was too late. Their flanking move ran into the same kill zones, the same overlapping fields of fire, the same drones hovering above them, watching, tagging, guiding artillery and missiles to their positions. This wasn't just a failed assault. It was a case study in how not to fight a modern war. Because every Russian mistake was Ukrainian opportunity, and every Ukrainian advantage was amplified by technology. Western-supplied Bradleys enabled quick infantry movements under armor. Leopard 2s held static firing positions and delivered long-range anti-armor strikes with impunity. Artillery crews received exact coordinates in real time and could shift fire missions in seconds. Even wounded units weren't left behind. The daring rescue of an isolated Ukrainian team, extracted by a single Bradley under fire, was more than heroism. It was proof that Ukraine's forces not only knew how to fight, but how to adapt, to think under pressure, to maneuver intelligently, to fight as one organism, not isolated limbs. That kind of cohesion doesn't happen by accident. It's trained, it's drilled, and most importantly, it's trusted. In a war like this, Trust is everything. Because when a drone operator sees a convoy, he has to trust that the artillery battery will react fast enough, that the comms will stay clear, that the strike won't be late. And in this battle, they weren't. Not once. Every unit clicked into place. Every strike landed within seconds. Every Russian retreat was tracked and harassed. Every movement mapped and filed for the next strike. So when observers say, no one knows why the brigade were destroyed, they're wrong. We know why. Because they were never given a chance to fight. They walked into a machine that had already decided how they would die. And it worked, not with overwhelming force, but with overwhelming information. This is the modern battlefield, not the thunder of armor, but the silence of a drone camera watching from above, the hum of a command vehicle receiving coordinates, the hiss of a missile launch based on live intelligence, and the quiet, exact result, 2 brigades. Gone. This is how you win without mass. This is how you make history in silence. And this is how Ukraine fights now. The battlefield was littered with the twisted remains of what had once been 2 full brigades. Burned-out hulks of tanks, their turrets thrown yards from their hulls. Armored personnel carriers frozen mid-turn, their tracks snapped, their crews long evacuated, or not. Smoldering craters where artillery had struck so precisely that the surrounding foliage still stood untouched. The ground itself surgically excavated beneath Russian feet. And above it all, still circling, still watching, were the drones. Not the drones you see in flashy military showcases. Not sleek, high-flying predator systems. No, these were cheap, rugged, and endlessly persistent. Quadcopters you could buy off the shelf, modified with thermal imaging, signal boosters, and sometimes with explosives of their own. Dozens of them, sometimes hundreds, orbiting like vultures. But smarter, faster, hungrier. They didn't just observe. They learned. Russian vehicles would try to shift positions, sliding laterally to avoid becoming predictable. But the drones tracked those patterns. They saw the moment engines started. They saw columns move and regroup. They fed that data directly to fire control centers that had already pre-sighted every likely fallback point, every rearmament lane, every temporary command post. It was hunting, not fighting. The Russian commanders, those who hadn't already lost comms or their armored command vehicles, tried to regroup, to call in their own air cover, to push forward faster and break through before the trap fully closed. But speed means nothing when you're being hunted in real time. Air cover was slow. Air defenses were jammed or spoofed. And the moment Russian helicopters crept into range, they were either painted by man-pads hidden in tree lines or forced to retreat from SAMs waiting just behind the next ridge. This was not an evenly matched fight. It wasn't even asymmetric. It was asymmetrical maturity, a defense that had grown smarter with every battle, more agile, more responsive. Ukraine wasn't just reacting anymore. It was dictating the rhythm of the battlefield, dictating where the fight would happen, dictating who would live and who would burn, and perhaps most dangerously for the attacker, dictating the story. Because while the wreckage of those 2 brigades told its own tale, the silence on the Russian side screamed something louder. They didn't see it coming. That's the danger in modern war. It's not about tanks. It's about time. If your enemy moves faster than your ability to think, you're not fighting a war. You're experiencing an event. You're watching a disaster happen around you, with no ability to stop it, only to endure it. Russia endured it, and lost. It didn't matter how many BMPs they had, how many T-72s they brought to the line, because this wasn't a war of quantity. It was a war of momentum, and Ukraine had stolen it. Every failed breakthrough attempt by Russian forces fed the Ukrainian machine. Every destroyed vehicle became a marker for new fire correction. Every dead zone became a lesson and a trap for the next wave. And the waves kept coming. Because the problem with frontal assaults in the modern age is that they don't just fail, they cascade. One column stalls. The column behind it stacks up, becomes vulnerable. Commanders grow desperate, push flanks that aren't ready. Flanks that have already been seen, already been mapped, already been mined. And so the collapse spreads, not like a detonation, like a contagion, confusion, fracture, isolation. Russian units, now scattered, attempted to dig in, but the ground had been prepared for this too. Ukrainian artillery didn't need to guess. It had targets, real-time corrections, munitions tailored for open armor or dug-in troops. And all the while, the Ukrainian side wasn't even exposed. They didn't need to reveal their positions. They didn't need to roll the dice, because they didn't fight by waiting. They fought by watching. This is a fundamental inversion in modern land warfare. The side that sees more wins more. It's no longer about mass formations finding a weak point. It's about sensors finding the truth faster than lies can protect it. And Russian forces? They were built on lies, on the assumption that they could advance faster than the enemy could respond. That assumption died in the minefields, where speed meant running into explosives faster. It died in the kill zones, where artillery arrived before the Russians could even fire their main guns. It died when air support was too scared to fly. It died when Russian infantry, dismounted from burning IFEs, ran into bursts of drone-guided mortar fire minutes after setting up cover positions. The assumption of dominance, gone. And in its place, hesitation, confusion, retreat. But in this battlefield, retreat doesn't save you, because the moment you try to pull back, you're marked again. Ukrainian drones track movement going in both directions. Offensive or defensive, it didn't matter. If you moved, you were seen. And if you were seen, you were dead. That's the horrifying reality Russia now faces. Mobility, once a tactical advantage, is now a liability. And static positions? Those are just slow kills. So where do you go when every path is a kill zone? Where do you hide when every trench is watched? What do you fight with when your formations are broken, your radios are jammed, your drones are destroyed, and your enemy never shows their face? These weren't questions Russia thought it would have to ask, but they're asking them now, and the answers aren't coming. Because this wasn't just a failed offensive. It was a preview of how wars will be fought for the next decade, with fewer tanks, with fewer trenches, with fewer lines, and with more sensors, more coordination, more decision speed. Russia brought a 20th century battle plan to a 21st century battlefield, and that battlefield spit it back out in pieces. Ukraine didn't just defend, they controlled the fight. Like a conductor, not a survivor. They set the tempo, they chose the terrain, and they made sure every Russian step forward came at a cost. And that's what makes this battle so terrifying to the next wave of attackers. Because even if you learn from this, even if you change tactics, shorten columns, spread formations, rotate commands, Ukraine's already moved on. They're watching. They're learning. And the next trap is already being built, not with sandbags, but with satellites, sensors, and software. The next Russian brigade that crosses into this kind of defense won't be facing the same tactics. They'll be facing something smarter, something faster, something they've never seen until it's already too late. That's not just a feat. That's design. That's doctrine. That's the future of ground combat. And it's here, now, on the battlefield where 2 brigades disappeared, and no one could explain why. But Ukraine knows. They didn't just destroy an assault. They redefined what it means to win one.